Ja. Okay, folks, welcome to this session where we're going to be in this auditorium just for 1 hour. We have to be out at 1 o'clock, and then we're going to walk 15 minutes over to U140, where there'll be coffee waiting for everyone. Welcome everyone, and again, wonderful that you're here. And again, thanks to the embassy and SDU for supporting this event. And now I'll basically, oh yes, one more thing. You've all received the program, and please fill in the or do the survey. There's a QR code, and you can do it on your phone easily. So that'll be wonderful if you all did that, basically, both for yesterday and today. But I'll give the word to Anders, who's going to introduce today's speaker, Professor Niels Eichhorn.
Thank you so much, Jan, and really glad to see familiar and also new faces here in this classroom. Excited to have a chance to learn from Niels again, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Wanted to relay an anecdote in relation to meeting Niels. It's October 4th today, but precisely 11 years ago, I had the pleasure of being part of a conference panel with Niels at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. And it was a small conference, but it was one where Eric Foner, the writer of the textbook that many of you have read, was the keynote. And so he gave a really interesting talk about the complexities of Abraham Lincoln's life and legacy on the first day of the conference. And on the next day, there were a bunch of panels, but because it was such a small venue, then everybody showed up for the same sort of conference panels. So that meant that that when Niels was presenting his work and I was in his panel, that we had Eric Foner and a bunch of other really interesting, good scholars in the audience. And while I think it's safe to say that my presentation in this conference was average at best, everyone, including Eric Foner, came really impressed, was really impressed with the way that Niels thought about and presented his ideas about American history, connecting the American Civil War to conflicts around the globe, demonstrating also his multilingual ability to think creatively about history. And this innovative ability, I think, coupled with an impressive work ethic, has been on full display since. So just for those of you that haven't come across Niels before, he received his BA and MA degree at the University of Louisiana, and his PhD degree from the University of Arkansas. So situated deeply in ideas about Civil War and its legacy in the South. He's been teaching in Georgia, he's been teaching in New Mexico, he's been teaching in Austria, and now he's teaching in Germany. And throughout his academic career, he has been impressively and sometimes almost annoyingly productive. In addition to having a bunch of editorial responsibilities at HNet, a really cool interdisciplinary forum for humanities scholars and also social sciences. Some of you should check it out, those mailing lists, if you're not on it already, HNet. He's also written numerous books. So in addition to his book, Liberty and Slavery, European Separatists, Southern Secession, and the American Civil War, that came out with the University, or Louisiana State University Press, one of the premier presses of this particular part of American history. He's also written on migration and trade and conflict and ideas. And recently he published The Civil War in the Age of Nationalism just a few months ago, also with LSU Press. I think it's safe to say that few people are better positioned than Niels to contextualize the current American election, both historically, regionally, and also globally. And for that reason, I hope you'll give him a warm welcome, and I will leave the floor to Niels.
Okay, that works. All right, thank you, Anders, for that very kind introduction. There's supposed to be something up there eventually. We'll see where that goes. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here as the rather intimidated keynote speaker of the morning. There we go. So I want to start today, actually, I'll get to an anecdote that will connect Anders, myself, and Mississippi one more time in a little bit. But I want to start first with sort of a few things that, as a historian, especially a historian of the 19th century, go and talk about the 2024 election, I cannot do, right? There are a few things that I just can't. One of those is I don't have a magic crystal ball. I cannot tell you how this election will go. Part that's probably good because I would make millions in betting otherwise. But on the other hand, there are a lot of smart people that are trying to give us predictions with regard to this election. There are also problems with those, as we have obviously seen in the 2016, 2020, and then also the 2022 midterm elections, right? That there just are limits in what we can predict. That because people don't honestly want to answer when surveys are being given to them, whether they are ashamed to say, I'm going to vote for one person or the other, or whatever that may be. Obviously, we do have sometimes very close to accurate predictions with regard to some political scientists at Virginia. At this stage, I think the map has not changed the last time I have seen it about a week or so ago. So we'll see how these toss-up states go. The other reason why I don't want to make predictions, this gets us back to Mississippi, is because I don't want to have anyone in this audience in 5 years come to me and say, but Mr. Eichhorn, you predicted. No. I don't need that. That is the anecdote I want to, in part, start with today. And that was also a conference a few years later. It was actually in 2016 at Ole Miss, or for those who are not in the known, University of Mississippi, Oxford, not the Oxford in the UK, the other Oxford. And a rather renowned Civil War historian and political party historian gave a keynote address in which the muttering of the audience was not too happy about, but the end result was Hillary Clinton would win, the Republican Party would have a massive epiphany, and would turn to what was termed a Eisenhower republicanism. As hindsight is 2020, we all know how that prediction ended up. It did not go too well. And I think that's in part also why I don't want to do a prediction. At the time, it sounded interesting. It sounded very interesting to kind of make a concept and say, this election of Trump as president will never, ever happen. And it's just impossible to fathom that the American public would do something like that. But it reminded me of 2012, when, if some of you might remember, a certain congressman from Minnesota was trying to go for the Republican presidential nomination, Michelle Bachmann. If you know Michelle Bachmann in any shape or form, you know what crazy stuff she was proposing and saying. And I had a friend who said, they should just nominate her. No one will ever vote for her. And my answer was, yeah, but what if they would? That is very dangerous to have somebody crazy like that so close to the presidency. Well, 2016 happened. Now, that all said, one of the things that I always like to caution about too, and that again is why I don't want to make any prediction, is that it's easy for us in a circle of like-minded or similarly minded people kind of talk about issues that might be at stake in an election. Right? That's why it kind of puts the ivory tower here. It's very easy for somebody in Boston or New York, no offense to those in the audience from there, to say, oh, this is just perceived problems. They're not real. For the person that experiences the factory closure, for the person that feels economically left behind, or whatever the reasoning may be, it is real. And they're going to go for the person or candidate that gives them the best feel-good answer, the person that's promising to solve their problems. Right? We don't have to look far for this. Look at the 2022 election in Italy. Look at the recent elections in the Netherlands or Germany. Right? People vote for what seems to be the savior of theirs. And I think that's something very dangerous, but it also makes a lot of sense, historically especially. So that said, I cannot predict to you what will happen in November. I have my hopes of what will happen. I have my worries of what will happen. There's a reason why I live in Europe today instead of the United States. So with that, I want to go and historically as well as modern look a little bit at our 2024 election. And unfortunately, one of the issues that we obviously have with the United States, historically as well as in modern times, public as well as academically, is that many believe the United States is sort of an exceptional place, that there is an exceptionalism about the United States. In most recent times, I like to use Ronald Reagan here with his shiny city upon a hill quotation. The perception is that the United States is sort of a beacon for democracy, a beacon for republicanism, a beacon for all things good. And Reagan is a perfect candidate to talk and to kind of start with here, in my opinion, because after all, it is Reagan who crafted the Republican parties that we have today in many ways. The alliance between, well, I'll get into in a little bit, Christian nationalism movements in the United States, evangelical movements in the United States, the abortion movement, if you want, anti-abortion movement in the United States, that is in large part a combination that Reagan starts. So him having kind of this first spot as a shiny city upon the hill seems very fitting. Of course, we can ask how this beacon of democracy really feels, right? Like how it feels when the United States comes in and wants to enlighten you. Right? I don't think the people in Iraq today feel like very enlightened and democratically imbued by an invasion almost 20 years ago. So there is, unfortunately, sometimes a missing component, missing links there. Reagan is not the first one. This goes, I promised my colleagues at lunch, I would go back up to 1620, and here I am delivering on that promise. We can go as far back as the Pilgrims coming to what at that stage would have been Bay Colony. The notion that coming to North America is that safety valve where they can experience religious freedom. Of course, if we look at the history of the Pilgrims, that religious freedom is everything but religious freedom for the non-pilgrims. And how much, in the end, we have actually religious freedom be left unsaid here. But it's John Winthrop who kind of gives us that idea, right? That the pilgrims will create this shiny city upon a hill, or he using it a little bit shorter here, but the notion is the same. And this is, again, where we kind of can say that exceptionalism that goes through US history, something that I have made a lot of effort in my scholarship to argue against, because every country wants to be exceptional. No offense to the audience members who are from Great Britain, but Britain has an exceptionalist streak in it. Germany has an exceptionalist streak in it. Every country in some form thinks of itself as special and exceptional. The United States just has the ability to do that a little bit bigger at times. That said, there are some exceptional moments to what we are going to see in this election. That's the fun thing about it. So the anti-exceptionalist scholar gives you some exceptionalism today. There are a good number of firsts, but none of them are necessarily all positive. All right? Sure, it is an exceptional moment to have a convicted felon run for president again, since this is, I might count at least the second time that has happened. Not something to necessarily be proud of. It's not necessarily something to be proud of to be the exceptional candidate who tried to overthrow the US government by not conceding power 4 years ago. I did want to give at least one that I think is rather exceptional and good to see finally we're going to have potentially the first Asian and African American woman president. That would be something exceptionally nice to see. But there's also a list of other firsts that very much could happen that would not be very good. Now, if you think back, as I said, when it comes to democracy, the United States likes to sometimes present itself as sort of that special place, the place where democracy found its 19th century foothold, was built and developed, and became sort of the symbol for the rest of the world to mimic. Who was born before 2000? Quick question for the audience. Who was born before 2000? All right. Okay, good. So a few at least. Well, I'm going to classify myself as old. If you're old as me, you might remember this beautiful instance. 2000, Florida, the butterfly ballot. It wasn't clear whether hole number 2 was choice number 2 or choice number 3. It was a big disaster. And that disaster brought George W. Bush Jr. to the presidency. The man, of course, who then goes and says, let's enlighten the people in the Middle East about how to do good government and embrace democracy. I'm not going to dignify anymore the invasion of Iraq with regard to what I already said, but I'm pretty sure that most Iraqis do not feel very enlightened today about what George W. Bush did and intended to do, but didn't deliver on. But Bush is just the latest in a long series of this type of presidential ambitions. When we think about the United States, a man that I hope Mr. Anders or one of the other professors has talked to you about with regard to a missionary impulse. Could quiz them, but I'm not going to. Woodrow Wilson. Heard of him? That racist guy that was running Princeton for a while and was governor of New Jersey for a while? Yeah, that guy. Guy that showed Birth of a Nation in the White House and thought it was a great movie and then started to segregate the US government. That guy. Yes. Guy that has really declined in the last few years when it comes to presidential rankings. Well, Wilson is mostly remembered today as the guy that takes the United States into the First World War or Great War, whichever one you prefer, but also is remembered for the failure of taking the United States into the League of Nations. What we sometimes forget about is that a few years before the First World War entry of the United States, he also almost went to war with Mexico. And one of his stated goals in that was to teach the Mexican people how to elect good men. Very ambitious, very imperialistic mind frame. Of course, a few years later, he also told the world that he was going to go into the First World War to make the world safe for democracy. I asked a big question there at the bottom of the slides that I think is rather interesting, right? How democratic is the United States really? When we think about it, 1914, women could not vote. That's 50% of the population right there. We have rules about race. No one who is African American in the South can vote. That eliminates again another easily 10%. Native Americans can't vote yet. That's still about 10 years in the future. So you kind of kept count. Less than 40% of the people in the United States can vote. And he goes to war with the countries that has manhood suffrage in Germany. The more Germans can actually vote than men in the United States can vote. And this man tries to say, hey, let's make the world safe for democracy. Yes, I'm going to the word hypocrisy in this moment. Right? So it is a moment that we do have on a number of occasions when it comes to the United States in its history. So let's ask the question, how is it today? Right? Because that's what we're here for. And I think one of the things that I want to first start with is the one-party districts, the uncontested single major party districts. There are, in the United States today, 37 congressional districts that the opposition party does not even bother to run a candidate in because it is so designed that it's worthless to put a cent into it. Heck, I could nominate my dog to run in West Texas and he would get elected if I put a big red R on his chest. Is that democratic? You don't really get a choice here. That is congressional elections, of course. But trust me, having lived in that region, there's not even purpose in the local election to run a candidate that is not with a red R on the chest, because you probably don't get much votes either. What you already kind of see maybe here on the map with regard to the congressional districts of the United States, they can be rather awkwardly shaped. I'll take a moment here with regard to Bo's Anders' introduction. I lived in New Mexico, the southeast corner right there. See that line that runs to the border with Texas down there? That line runs right through the city. The southern part of the city, which is Hispanic mostly, is in one congressional district. The more well-off part is another congressional district. By golly, were they upset about that party gerrymandering that was taking place to their beloved city and how the Democrats were stealing that congressional district from them. So they boycotted the election. Guess what? That congressional district that they could have voted in had a majority win for the Democrats by under 5,000 votes. They had voted, probably could have been theirs, but they decided to just not do it. The sad reality, though, is that throughout the United States, and this can be local level, this can be state level, things don't look well. Right? The congressional maps in particular are designed in many places by political parties, and those political parties design them on purpose to gain majorities. Right? I'm picking North Carolina because I think it's the easiest and the best example in this. If you look at presidential elections, North Carolina usually is a close election. It's not that we're talking like 60-40. We're talking usually 55, 57 to the 40 equivalency here. It's not that this is a very like wide margin win. If you look at the congressional delegation from North Carolina, however, you would think totally opposite. Because the state is designed in such a fashion that the Republican Party carries a vast majority of the congressional districts. And that's what we have with gerrymandering in the United States. And that's why talking about the 2024 election, it is crucial to also think not, and when you look at the results, when they start to come in, don't just look at the presidential election. It will matter on the state level, even more so. Because the states are the key. Assume Kamala Harris wins. She will most likely face a Republican Senate, which means we're going to have a divided government because who knows what the House will look like. But it will be very difficult for her to make any meaningful policy adjustments because it's not going to be Mitch McConnell, God thanks, but it's probably going to be somebody worse than Mitch McConnell, which is tough to imagine. But the result will be the stonewalling, just like what Mick Johnson currently is doing with the House. So it will greatly matter how these state elections turn out. More so, what will matter is that Democrats need to make inroads in the states themselves. Governor elections, state house, and state senate elections will be of great importance in the years to come because that is the bodies that can change those maps. And as long as they stay the way they are, the United States is hardly any way democratic. Here's why. Look, if I live on the edge of Charlotte, why should I vote as a Democrat? It doesn't matter. If I live in the city of Charlotte, it doesn't matter either because it's so overwhelmingly Democratic. I have a friend in California. When Biden was still running, she was like, I don't like Biden. I'm not going to vote this year. I have a colleague today who was like, no, if you can't vote, you should vote. And I'm like, why? California is solidly a Democratic state. One vote was not going to change anything in that state. So I get what she is doing. Of course, all of what I just said is largely meaningless because of the most undemocratic item in the United States, which is, of course, the United States Supreme Court. And unfortunately, Mr. Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has made it his stated goal to reduce the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'm not going to go into details. We can do that maybe in the Q&A with regard to the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act, and so on. But as early as 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder, Roberts has started to chip away at the Voting Rights Act. And the more you see, the more cases are brought before the court, the more you start seeing more and more of this chipping away. Right? And that is the great danger in the United States, that assumes the election ends in some form of stalemate in 2024. This is the group that will likely, like in Gore versus Bush in 2000, makes the decisions. And you can be sure that the three nominees that the 2016 elected President Trump put on this court are not going to recuse themselves, nor is the one black man going to recuse himself, even though his wife was very much involved in the attempt at January 6th insurrection. So it's going to be an odd election if it comes to the Supreme Court and the results that will come with that. But watch these guys. They are extremely dangerous. Kind of like that Bruce Willis movies, retired, extremely dangerous. They're all retirement age, so they're all extremely dangerous, really. Thank God they don't have weapons. Now, as I promised to you earlier to you, there's one topic I do want to get back to, and that's religion. Because I think when it comes to religion, it is one of the most important things to consider when it comes to the United States. Give you another anecdote. When I first started teaching, especially US history, there were two sayings that I promised myself I will never, ever touch: religion and guns. I will not talk about the Second Amendment. I will not talk about religion. And I usually told that to my students as I had a slide behind me in the last couple of years that we were going to talk about the United States as a Christian nation. And my next statement was, well, I'm breaking one of my cardinal rules because I have come to realize that it is extremely important in the United States that religion matters. The sad reality, I think, in this is that I was grown up, like probably a lot of you, in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany. You have your Danish equivalency. I do not recognize what a lot of American Christians do. I could give you a picture of like the capitalist Jesus and how you have like these Texas mega churches and everything. And it is an odd situation where there's no critical thinking in it. There's no like compassion in it. There's no helping others in this. Like I always ask my students at the end of my class when we talked for an hour about Christian nationalism in the course of US history, I always ask them, look, how come the country, the Western country that has one of the highest church attendances, the United States has one of the highest church attendances among Western countries, has one of the worst records when it comes to taking care of its people. Whereas countries like Germany, France, Denmark, who have extremely low church attendance on a weekly basis, have one of the best records when it comes to taking care of its people. Isn't that the main message of the Bible? I always ask them then to think of how can you help other people? How can you be compassionate with them? Never got an answer from my students, but I hope that at least in their minds there was something that I left that they could think about with this. The other parts I always reiterated to them was that great when you're on the beneficiary end of these decisions right now, but you might be ending up on the receiving end of it. COVID kind of started to show us some of that. But there's also this hypocrisy. Anyone remember the Roy Moore election in Alabama about 4 years ago? Okay, at least I get one nod in the audience. The man was accused of various sexual harassments of underage girls. And everyone who was solidly going to vote for him was like, nah, it's not important. I mean, good God, come on, right? How is that not important? How does that not qualify a candidate? Don't answer. I know the 2016 election and the statements that were made. I got the answer already. But I just love that image that you have there up there of the lady, right? Total violation of the American flag code, putting on all this American paraphernalia, and then God invoked to kind of make the case that Roy Moore should be elected. How much more crazy can you get? There's a lot of great articles out there these days with regard to the cultishness of the Trump following, the challenge that religion should be facing but isn't facing, pastors that make any kind of statements opposite to Trump being elected. that are kind of thrown out. Again, if we have time in the Q&A, I'd be happy to kind of talk a little bit more about sort of the religious aspect, because I think it's a very interesting and important aspect. But I do want to also talk very briefly about the issues that we have most in front of us, I think, again, in this election cycle too, and that is fraud, right? The accusation of fraud. And we already see it with former President Trump in this election cycle, that he's already setting the stage to kind of say, look, they're going to cheat. It's going to be rigged. It's going to be unfair. He's already setting that up, which could dramatically undermine the election. That is not uncommon, unfortunately. U.S. election, as much as the United States and some scholars today want to think of the United States as sort of this beacon that the world love to imitate, sort of like we said in our books, it's sort of the United States is the sun around which the rest of the universe orbits. It's not. You look at Britain, you look at Germany, you look at France, all these democratic reformers in these countries, they look to the United States in the 19th century and say, like, no, 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 that's not what we intend to do. Because they know that the public knows that when it comes to US elections, people think about is fraud, is violence, is ballot box stuffing. It's not legitimate. It's bad. Democracy is bad. So they all want to have some form of more enlarged franchise where more people can vote, but they don't want the US system because they see what's going on. They have read the reports. They have read the newspaper articles, right? And I mean, if you have done any studying in US history, you can sympathize with this, right? It's sort of like, I'm a Civil War historian. I know the results of Kansas, when Kansas wants to be a state, and Oxford and McGee County in Kansas. That's always the beauties. 10,000 people magically get beamed down out of the Cincinnati directory and appear on the voting rolls, and then disappear again in a county of like 100 residents. That's fraud. It's massive fraud. Tweet ring in New York. Send them a third time to vote so that the election comes out the right way. Baltimore. Oh, you want to vote in this district? You better be of the right party allegiance or we'll beat you up. They had all kinds of mechanisms to keep people from voting. And I'm not even going to dignify the 1876 election. That was an atrocity, especially in a place like Louisiana. It has a sad déjà vu moment, and especially 2020, when a lot of this concern over mail-in ballots started to come up. When you had literally armed men at mail-in ballot drop-offs trying to watch, okay, who is coming? Are you voting probably for the right person? Are you darker skinned? Are you maybe illegally voting? Right? And then judges having to step into this and giving us a not very clear record on that. Now I'm going to give you a statistic of survey data up there. At the Conservative Heritage Foundation, so please appreciate, I actually went down some rabbit holes that will haunt my cookies for a while on my browser history. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank investigating election fraud. They have a nice little map on their website to kind of tell you how bad it is. Example, Texas. From 2005 to 2022, they found maybe? Yeah, there it is again. They found 103 cases of election fraud. 103. In that time, there were over 107 million ballots cast. I'm not good at math. You can do some math on that, what percentage it is. But thankfully, I can actually give you the percentage. It is 0.00096%. That's infinitesimally small. The same with Arizona, right? Kerry Lake, 2022, said the election that she lost was rigged, that there was fraud, that she was stolen from her, which she still maintains today. And I looked up what they had with regard to that. They had 8 cases. 8 cases that the Heritage Foundation found for the so-called stolen Kerry Lake election. Doesn't matter though, because the people that believe this will believe it. They don't look at the data. They don't do the research that we do. That brings me somewhat back full circle to where I started earlier and said, often what we debate is not what the people down on the streets say. Okay? So the people that will vote for Trump, it's the reality that Kerry Lake lost the election because of fraud, that he lost the election because of voter fraud in Pennsylvania, or if you want, Georgia, right, Fulton County. To them, that is real. There's very little, I feel, I hope I'm wrong, that we can do sometimes about it. We need to do something about it. Because that irreality that they're facing leads to moments that are extremely dangerous. Right? January 6th, that was shocking. I taught the next week, and it was sort of like, how do you deal with this now? I've never had this. I actually made my co-author insert a last sentence as we were about to send off the manuscript. During 4 years of war, the Confederates never got even close to the U.S. Capitol. They got close to Lincoln's stovepipe hat at Fort Stephenson, but that was about it. They were never going to get anywhere close to the U.S. Capitol. Yet on January 6th, the Confederate flag made it into the Capitol building. I remember the video of the guard, the police officer for the Capitol holding the door open as they filed out. No charges done, no anything, no handcuffs, right? Like it was visitors leaving again, which of course some Republicans today want you to believe they were, which we of course know that was not it. And there's thousands, thankfully, now that are convicted for trespassing and other crimes. But of course, if the Supreme Court, some of the cases that have gone up to it, hold, who knows how many of those convictions get thrown out. Not to mention that we now have a conversation about presidential immunity, whether this was actually a legitimate act as president that you could do. So where does that all leave us? I would argue, in large part, it is not very unusual what we're seeing when we look long-term at U.S. history. Election violence was common. Ballot box fraud was common. Problems with democracy in the U.S. have been common. But it's common because we failed. They failed in the past. We have failed in the now. And that's hopefully where we can bring some change in the decades to come. People in the United States will change. As little hope as I have for that sometime. There needs to be change. Thank you. Yeah. You can do the mics. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. You can yell. I can probably hear and repeat.
Yeah, it's working. So
yeah.
We have about 10 minutes for a quick Q&A.
There's one.
So speaking about democracy in the US, right now, when I'm looking at the Democrats and the Republicans, right, you have these kinds of opposing worldviews where the Democrats, they acknowledge that, America has contributed badly towards climate change. They say we've faced all these issues with discrimination in the past that continues with police brutality, et cetera, et cetera. They face all these issues head on. Whereas the Republicans, they usually provide very simplistic and satisfying solutions, externalizing the problems to immigrants or saying, for the economy, let's just put 20% tariffs on everything, that'll solve it, right? But my question is not so much how do you make that, how do you expose them to the truth? Because I think a lot of these Republicans are exposed to the truth, but it's that when you see those worldviews, it also means that the Republicans, when you accept this kind of conspiratorial narrative, it makes themselves the heroes. These American soldiers fighting against the corrupt Democrats who are stealing the election, who are doing all these things with the corrupt judges and the globalized, forces, all that stuff. It's a very satisfying narrative, and what it means is even if they might have the truth thrusted upon them on a daily basis, how do you make them respect that truth or make it even important to them, right? That's my kind of question: is how do you thwart this kind of thing?
If I knew the answer, I would be a millionaire. No, I don't. I don't know how. That's the biggest challenge that I think this generation coming up has to face. And I think there is a substantial chunk of the population that lives in denial, right? And we have reached an impasse where people don't want to talk to each other. People don't want to listen to each other. And I think that is the biggest problem, the lack of ability to listen, to engage civilly, right? We're going to get engaged in a civil discussion rather than a hostile one, and be willing to disagree about things. Right? Like it has become, and my wife, I catch her sometimes saying it's an us versus them situation. And when you think of the world in that kind of stark reality, and this is on both sides, there is not a lot you have to fundamentally change a person. And it is extremely hard to that fundamentally change somebody. So it would require an earth-shattering situation moment to kind of get that accomplished, I think. So that's the answer I can offer, and not a very positive one, unfortunately. It's going to be a hard one.
No, I don't know. I was just a bit puzzled by your use of history. I mean, one thing is to talk about hypocrisy, but there's also the danger of cynicism. And you were comparing the electoral system of the late 19th century, where there was widespread fraud, also very high voter participation, but also widespread fraud. And then the link to the current situation, the Heritage Foundation, Loyola Law School made a survey of 1 billion votes from 2000 to 2014 and found, I think, 31,
that's nice.
Out of 1 billion.
Yeah.
So, I mean, something happened in between. And there have been people working on securing elections and so on. And I think that should somehow be part of the story and one of the ways in which you demonstrate that this is not the 19th century and that that particular historical lesson is less useful to view in order to evaluate current elections. So perhaps that should be part of the story as well. What happened between, say, 1892 and now?
Sure. If you give me another hour, I gladly do that. That's a good question, right? And I think in many ways the secret ballot is a big aspect in that. So eventually the Australian ballot is brought to the United States. But at the same time, when you look at the current situation, right? This goes back to your earlier question of the entrenchment of views. Just yesterday, a Colorado County clerk was convicted finally and sentenced to 9 years for giving somebody access to Dominion's voting system. So yes, we can easily say today, well, yes, there was a lot of safety, but in the perception of a substantial number in the US population, that safety is gone. They believe that voting machines have been tampered with. And I would actually say that coming out of the 2000 election, right, that butterfly ballot where it's sort of like, well, who did you vote for? The trust has started to erode. I take your point that it's very difficult to draw a comparison between the 19th century election system and the 20th century. But I think the same trust issues that people in the 19th century had with the electoral system is there again, was a part of the population. Yes. Yeah. And how many voters on Fox News will hear about that? And some of them will file it as, oh, the deep state is coming after them, you know, and that's sort of the concern I see with sort of the eroding of the trust.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, when we talk about America as a Christian nation, with when it comes to voting habits and stuff, we've seen a worrying rise in Latino Americans voting for Republicans, and it often comes from the evangelicization of their Latino Catholic beliefs. Do you think it's something we can tackle, and if so, how?
That's a great question. Thank you for it. It's a hard one, and I think you see the same with the. Okay, let me start with Latino. I want to then briefly transition also to the African American vote. But I think with Latinos, you also start to see a lot of the issues with people wanting to see change, and it's not affecting their community. And it sort of goes back to sort of what I started with, that if you don't feel the parties that you voted for years and that you kept alive and powerful for years isn't doing what you want them to do, you're going to look to the parties that might deliver. And I think we have to be careful with Latino, because Latino is a broad descriptor that doesn't work well. And we have started to finally engage that problem. So I think that's in part what we're seeing. I'm very curious to see how this will play out with this election. My wife had a lot of African American coworkers during the Hillary Clinton election who said, my husband is like, I'm not going to vote for Hillary because she's a woman, right? And my worry when Kamala first was suggested as a candidate was the same thing, that this would happen again, that there are going to be a lot of guys who are going to say, oh, she's a woman, I'm not going to vote for her. And it could turn the election. It sounds, from what I can gather, the spirit is not that, but we'll have to see. So, long answer. I'm having a boss standing there that wants to end things.
Thank you so much, Niels Eichhorn, for a very stimulating and interesting talk. So everyone give a round of applause. And